Hi, students. I wanted to go ahead and give you a little bit of commentary on this chapter here. This is by far one of the most important chapters, and I wanted to save it towards the middle or end of the semester so you had some context. You've seen how the Supreme Court can alter the meaning of the Constitution, and you'll see later on in this chapter through the 14th Amendment how the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment, was pushed down and forced to apply to all state and local laws through the incorporation doctrine. All right. Originally, the Bill of Rights only applied to Congress, right? It limited the power of what Congress could do, what the federal government could do. Didn't really apply to the states. The states had their own bills of rights in their constitutions. All right. But over time, they've started to apply this to the states. So in this chapter, especially right here, it starts talking about equality through law. And then it asks this question, what does equality mean? And so there's an article I'm going to have you read on Thursday, equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, right? Two different conceptions of what equality means. If we're talking about equality of outcome, I'm looking at statistics and looking at, say, income, for example, and do women earn the same as men? Do blacks earn the same as whites? Do Asians earn the same as Hispanics, right? We're looking at the outcomes and then basing whether or not there is discrimination on if those statistics are equal. So that's one way of looking at equality of outcome. Right? Where do people end up? And if they don't end up in the same area, then there must be something wrong, right? Now, equality of opportunity, just to sum up, means that it doesn't really matter where you end up as long as the process by which you get there is free from discrimination. So we may end up in different places due to different interests, different levels of motivation when it comes to how hard we work, uh, different levels of educational achievement, right? Some people go to college, some don't. These all have effects, right? When we have children, when we get married, whether or not we stay married, whether we have children in a marriage or outside of a marriage, these are all decisions that we make, whether knowingly or unknowingly, that will have a huge impact on our outcomes. And if those outcomes aren't equal, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's been some sort of discrimination that has taken place. Okay? So, by the way, I'm going to be just sort of freestyling these notes, or this commentary. So, if it's a little choppy, go ahead and forgive me. So, here's a topic that has generated a lot of controversy, and there may have been a time when affirmative action was needed. Today, though, that's hotly contested, right? So, affirmative action, when it was first started, gave preferential treatment to certain groups that had experienced discrimination. It was a way to sort of give them a leg up, a hand up, to get them on equal footing with the majority groups, right? It has led to, in recent years, some interesting court cases. One, for instance, was in California where a white man named Alan Bach had applied to get into a university, and it was proven that he had better scores, but because of affirmative action, his space, since it's limited, right, the number of people who can get into the school is limited, was given to a minority student. And he sued, saying that he was being discriminated against based on his race, right? So I think he actually ended up winning this argument, right? He won this case, and there have been other cases in recent years. One right there in UT Austin, um, where a white girl or she felt she was discriminated against because she didn't get in despite having grades in the top 1%. All right. But the University of Austin felt that that policy, right, where they grant admission to all students in the top, I think it's 10% actually, um, was leading to a student body that had too many white people, right? It didn't have enough minorities. So they wanted to not let her in so they could shape the contours of their student body. and so she sued, right? So as we'll see in this text and in the chapter I'm going to have you read, um, different people have different views about affirmative action. I mean, even some black people don't like it per se because other people begin to question their achievements, and they give less weight to their achievements because they think that the government has helped them through affirmative action policies, right? So you didn't get to be the president of your company because of your hard work and merit and your brains. You got here because you had help, right? That you had preferential treatment. And so there are actually many black people that want to see affirmative action go away so that the achievements that they earn won't be diminished by these common assumptions. So here's another common theme that I wanted to bring up, and it's the case of disparate impact. Now, that's not a term I think your textbook uses, but if you do a quick search for it, you'll see that it's become quite common. And whenever there are statistical disparities, such as the one cited here, where the wealth, the median net worth of households headed by black retired people is less than 20,000, while those compared to white people is around 200,000. So they would look at this disparity and immediately assume that there must be some sort of discrimination, right? And one of the things I'm hoping that you will learn through some of the other readings is that statistical disparities alone um, are not evidence of discrimination. That you have to look deeper into the data to see if discrimination is the cause of that disparity, or if there are other mitigating factors that are leading to the disparity. Okay, so if I go farther down here, you can see that sometimes people have a point, right? And that's what makes this issue confusing, because sometimes there is discrimination, and then other times there isn't. But every time they see this, every time I just say liberals, every time they see disparities, they immediately jump to discrimination. So in this example here, black criminals tend to get longer jail sentences than whites. And I remember one of the issues was crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. And it turns out it's true that if you're busted for crack cocaine, you tend to get a longer jail sentence than if you're busted for powder cocaine. Well, it turns out that white people tend to prefer powder cocaine, which happens to be more expensive, and black people tend to be users of crack cocaine. Um, uh, so there might be some discrimination in those jail sentences, right? But it's interesting because this is a government policy that is discriminating against a minority, not necessarily a private company. So when they start looking at incomes of black families versus white families, this, I think, is a key issue right here, where they're talking about the family structure. And this is a fact here that many more black children grow up in single family homes, right, than in white families or Asian families. This does have an effect on the earning potential of the kids in those homes, because quite often the culture in that household doesn't value education to the degree that a two-parent household would, right? In fact, there are people who argue that the reason the black homes have disintegrated has a lot to do with the welfare policies passed back in the 60s. If you start comparing black households to white households pre 1960, you see that they're very similar in structure. Then post 1960, you start to see big changes, right? Where now 70% of black children are born into single parent households, and that number is much lower for white and Hispanic people, right? Well, that's going to again have a lot to do with the different outcomes that people experience. And many of the same arguments that you'll see in the chapter are also applicable to the gender gap, right? I've included a few videos to sort of give you some context here, but the book clearly makes the argument that there is still a great deal of discrimination against women, right? They talk about a glass ceiling where only 5% of CEOs are headed by women, or 5% of corporations have CEOs that are women, right? And when they compare income for full-time employees for men and women, it turns out that women make 80%. Well, is that proof of discrimination? Are businesses trying to hire women and pay them less? Or are there other factors that are leading to that outcome? Are there decisions being made by men and women that are leading to this disparate outcome, this disparity, right? So if you watch those two videos, you'll see a bunch of reasons that can explain this other than discrimination. And that's kind of what I want you to get at, right? Is that just because you see a disparity, a statistical disparity, that you don't just immediately jump to discrimination as the cause. You have to sort of dig into the data to see if that's what's causing it or if there are other things. For example, in Walmart, they found that there weren't as many women managers as male managers. And after digging into the reasons why, they found that to become a manager, they often required you to work a night shift. Well, if you're a woman and you have a child, working a night shift is not going to be something that you really want to do. And this did lead to more males becoming managers, right? Or it could just be that they don't want the job, as in this case, right? A truck driver. There's more men who are driving trucks than women. What does that mean? That trucking companies are discriminating against women? Or again, are there other reasons, right? It's not truck driving isn't a job that is conducive to raising a family. So I can understand why women would rather not drive a truck when they're trying to have a family, or if they already have children. That makes sense. So as I wrap up this commentary, I wanted to make a few last points. One is that there tends to be a political motivation for finding discrimination, because then that justifies some sort of political action, or it might justify my campaign, right? Hillary Clinton right now is running a campaign that claims to fight for women, to fix all the injustices that exist. And she doesn't want to acknowledge some of the other mitigating factors that lead to disparities between men and women. She wants to use the government to pass legislation that will have as its intent stopping discrimination. So in order to pass the legislation, she has to try to prove that it exists, and to try to convince you that there's a reason to elect her so she can fight on that behalf. Uh, Another interesting point too is just because a group experiences discrimination, it doesn't always mean that they're going to be held back. Consider Jews. They've been chased out of country after country and experience anti-Semitism in many different times and locales. And yet today, they make up about 3% of the American population, yet they win 22% of the Nobel Prizes that Americans win. And they tend to be very successful financially as well in many different fields, despite any discrimination. And in fact, I think in the book, one of the chapters you're going to read, it talks about Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, yet the generation that followed, their kids actually do better than white children do. So just because there's a group that experiences discrimination doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to hold them back. They may have to work a little harder, fight through it, but it can be done.